Hello, I'm Tony Robinson from the University of Colorado, Denver, and this is part two of a two-part talk on the rise of Korea as a global economic and cultural power. And in this part, I'll be talking about the creation of the Korean wave, Hallyu, which is this modern rise of Korean cultural power in the world. When we say cultural power, I'm talking not about the developments I talked about in the last presentation, which is Korean might through the production of concrete and steel and freeways and cars, but is Korean power through the production of cultural forms, fashion, art, music, movies, dramas on TV. This kind of cultural power, which you see to the right of your screen, is the kind of most rapidly rising form of Korean economic influence in the world. Um, in fact, this is what we call now the Korean wave, or Hallyu. That it's launching. Many books have been written about this subject recently. Maybe most famously, Yoon Hong's book, The Birth of Korean Cool: How One Nation is Conquering the World Through Pop Culture. And it is, in fact, dominating many places of the world. Asia, for example, the dominant cultural force in terms of movies, music, um, art right now is the tiny nation of South Korea. It is dominating Japanese music scene. It is dominating Vietnam and Thailand and Laos. Very influential in China and India. Um, there's considerations in nations like China of putting restrictions and bans on the importing of Korean movies because they're overwhelming the local movie scene. When you have Asian awards for music, Korea right now is dominating all those awards. This is what we call the Korean wave, or Hallyu. You see it represented in architecture, as I talked about in my part one of the presentation. What we see here is two city halls. In the front of the front one, the kind of small concrete building, was built by the Japanese when they colonized Korea in the 1920s through 40s. And it was built where the old palace stood, and it was meant to be a form of military force and might, and it's kind of dark, powerful building. Only recently, the Koreans shut down that city hall, and Seoul opened up its new city hall, which is this giant glass building behind the Japanese building. And you see this building is a wave. It looks like a tsunami coming down on top of the Japanese building, which is an interesting political statement. But it isn't just this show of kind of blunt force as a kind of tsunami dropping on a building. But notice how it's kind of glass and curvy and transparent and kind of representative of modern architecture and soft cultural forms. And this is the new kind of cultural power that is emerging out of Korea, this more futuristic, softer cultural power. Inside the Korean City Hall is this sculpture of balloons that is called the Korean people, the aspirations of the Korean people. I find it interesting. It's this towering sculpture of balloons culminating in this white burst of energy. And it also kind of represents these aspirations of Korean people to be again, modern, soft, transparent, and kind of this new clean form of power, which is very different than the old industrial freeway building, smokestack, more what we think of as kind of darker industrial power, is being transcended in this shift to soft power in Korea today. When I say soft power, you're talking cultural forms like this. Musical groups like Big Bang, this female musical group. These are K-pop groups that are incredibly powerful right now in Korea and across the world. In Korea itself, we find that Korean music revenues have grown 23% since 25 every year, 6 times the overall Korean GDP growth. Even while world music markets are down since 2005 quite a bit, 23%, Korean music export revenues are up 36% every year from 25 to 2011, and that continues today, 2015, 2016, 100% growth per year from 28 to 2011. So that growth just keeps escalating. Korean video game exports are going up 37% from 25 to 2015. The foreign purchase of Korean movie rights is increasing. This is a rising cultural force. You can see it by looking at Google search trends. And if you query Google for J-pop, that is Japanese popular music, versus K-pop, Korean popular music, you see that right around 2008, Korean popular music starts catching on, and then a dramatic escalation to where Korean popular music searches right now on Google 4 times what Japanese popular music ever reached. So it is an incredibly powerful force in the world. People are interested in it. They're looking for it worldwide. You see in these images Korean festivals. In on the image, the top image to your left is a Korean festival in Egypt, and then to your right you have Korean music and art festival in China, and below that to your left is India, and then to the right again is France. And these are just signs of everywhere you go in the world today, there's an increasing number of K-pop festivals, Hallyu festivals, Korean cinema festivals. Um, it is an undeniable force in the world. What I'd like to talk about is how it became that force. And I'd like to talk about 2 things. First of all, the fact that it is a strategically produced industry. In a partnership between the state and big business, this industry is not accidental. It was produced strategically. And secondly, talk a little bit of how it's built on these kind of modern warrior workers. They're not that different than the old factory workers 20, 30 years ago. These are now art workers, but they also work under long hours, brutal conditions, tightly controlled by their industry to produce a new form of Korean economic power. In terms of the kind of strategic creation of K-pop and Hallyu by a state corporate partnership, you got to go back to 1997. And right after 1997, this was a deep economic crisis for Korea. They had to borrow money from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, large wave of unemployment, deep economic crisis. And as a response to that crisis, top government thinkers said, we need to emerge out of this crisis with a new form of economic power. We can't just try to go back to dominating concrete and maybe oil refining and framing of apartment buildings. That was our early industrial era. We need to now move into the modern creative economy era and kind of take the next step and become a creative economy. President Kim at the time created a Korea Creative Contents Agency with a job to export Korean culture to the world in partnership with the Korean Exim Bank, which put a huge amount of money into this. They doubled the share of the budget to support culture under the basic law for the cultural industrial promotion in 1999. So a tremendous amount of money put into this. And where did that money go? Well, it laid the infrastructure. Korea became the most wired country on earth, broadband everywhere, Korean young people and old people everywhere able to connect to the internet no matter where they are. Hundreds of millions of dollars in government funds to build K-pop venues all across the nation. A lot of these venues that are built to push their industry were built by the government itself, especially following, again, the 2008 recession. And together with all that, the government produced a strategy of, on their own government websites and in their own government broadcasts, of promoting Hallyu. If you go to the Korean government websites or the City of Seoul websites, you'll find images like this and promotion of the movie industry of Korea, kind of pushed as an official state project. In fact, following 1997, and again following 2008, these are 2 economic crises, the government of Korea built a strategy of targeting markets to export this industry to. And they said, look, the American Hollywood dream machine kind of ignores Thailand and Vietnam and Laos. They're not pushing into India in the way that we might be able to. They're not pushing into the Chinese market in the way that we can. And because these are kind of ignored markets by the American Hollywood dream machine, we're going to target those markets, and we're going to send our artists there, and we're going to subsidize advertising there, and we're going to target young artists in those countries, like young Laotians or young Vietnamese artists, and bring them to Korea and make them part of our Korean bands, and then ship them back to Vietnam and perform. And this will be a strategic effort to target newly emerging markets in Asia and be at the front edge of that rising Korean wave. And they did that. They launched, President Park Geun-hye recently, kind of reaffirming that strategy, launched the Ministry of Future Creation and Science. I think that's an interesting name, the Ministry of Future Creation, with a goal to make software and cultural products the core of the Korean economy and to craft a creative economy ecosystem. So it's definitely a strategy of the government to make this happen. And they were successful. in these other countries where they exported their business to. They are now dominating nations like Vietnam and Laos in terms of music sales. And then back in the home country, Korea itself, the government created all these venues for the performance and exporting of these products. On the left, you see Dongdaemun Design Plaza. On the right, you see buildings right across from that design plaza, owned by Lotte, a lot of them, where a lot of the where a K-pop production facility is located. Both of these very modernistic, soft cultural, powerhouse forms that you can kind of see in these buildings. These are produced with state subsidies. These aren't produced by the private market. The state of Korea itself and the Seoul government put hundreds of millions of dollars into making these projects happen. And when you go to these sites, you find both the kind of modernistic aspirations of Korea and Seoul, but you also have production facilities where the industry is being marketed to tourists and to others. You have a hologram concert hall where you can go watch K-pop holograms perform, and that's what you see on the right here are dancers on the outside of this hologram hall, kind of leading the tourists in. So you find this, and there's other examples of the state corporate alliance that has made Hallyu happen. Another good example is the fact that K-pop is dominated by the big three, kind of vertically integrated companies. SM, KYP, YG, they dominate the top element of Korean music in terms of popular music, and certainly globally. And it isn't just the fact that they dominate, it's that they're supported by the state in the creation of a legal regime that is going to support these companies. These selected modern, they're not chaebols, but large corporations. Chaebols means kind of a vertically integrated company that has lots of products across the economy. Well, these are very specific companies. They just produce music, but they are supported by the state. They're supported with subsidies. They're supported with a favorable legal regime that I'll talk about in a minute. They have this vertically integrated strategy for tightly producing cultural products. Here are some elements of that strategy. They locate talent, young talent in Korea and in other countries, and then they sign that talent on through contracts, and then have long training, 4 to 6 years, before people are allowed to release a new group onto the scene. The talent they discover is usually around age 9 to 12. They may be older, but they can be as young as 9 to 12. And they will enroll in these in-house academies sometimes, dorms, voice and dance lessons, school classes. And to be part of this academy that these students literally move into, they will sign sometimes 10 to 15-year contracts. They'll have rules about how often they can see their family, when they get to have visitation with maybe a boyfriend or a girlfriend, if they can even have a boyfriend or girlfriend, drinking, smoking, tattoos, work habits, all spelled out in the contract. After these new warrior workers, have served their time for years dancing and learning choreography and learning music, they are then placed in a company-designed group. Tightly polished company design. These aren't products of the group themselves. They didn't come up with the idea. The companies kind of created these ideas. And so each group will have, maybe it's bad boy, or maybe it's young schoolgirl looking performer. And then each one will be put in a precisely defined role, and then the group will be released to the world. Tightly polished, heavily produced, state subsidized, marketed to specific nations like Korea, like Laos and Vietnam. This is a product of a state corporate alliance to form a new form of economic power in the world. Uni Hong, in her book, calls it Korean cool. We could also call it soft power, and how it's come to be. And what we talk about when we say soft power is that Korea is now moving from producing low-cost industrial items at the directions of outside consumers like wigs or ships, and they are now producing new cultural forms that they are designing, which are attracting the allegiance of the globe. When I say attracting the allegiance of the globe, I mean it's working. China's trade deficit in cultural goods with Korea is 10 times larger than their industrial goods deficit. So Korea exports more industrial goods to China than they import, but they export way more cultural goods to China. 6% of the entire Korean economy is now just tourism. And that doesn't count K-pop, movies, K-drama, none of that. We also have, as part of that tourism, the rise of what is called the beauty belt. This is an area of Seoul that does medical tourism, that people come and they get beauty surgery, they whatever form, plastic surgery. And Korea is now the leading destination on earth for beauty surgery of this kind of global elite going to Korea, where the top doctors now are and the top medical tourism and plastic surgery occurs. And what this all points to is how Seoul is converting to what we could call a soft city future. The old Seoul and Korea that I talked about in my first presentation, part one, was built on factories producing industrial goods and producing freeways and cars and concrete and apartments and ships and oil production. And you see that in the left-hand picture in this screen. But as Korea has become wealthy and powerful, they are now converting their economic power into a form of cultural power. And you can even see that reflected in cityscapes across Korea, where they are tearing down old factories and old freeways and converting them to beautiful, softer forms of architecture. On the right, you see Cheonggyecheon Stream, which runs right through the middle of Seoul. What is interesting is that stream used to be a freeway. If you look to the left of this screen, you see the Seoul-Busan Freeway, which ran right through the middle of Seoul, down to Busan. In part one of this two-part presentation, I talked about how it was produced by Hyundai 50 years ago. That freeway, a couple years ago, about 5 years ago, Seoul decided it was time to destroy that freeway. And a president, Lee Myung-bak, who was mayor of Seoul at the time, said, we need to get rid of the freeway and convert Seoul to a softer, more beautiful city. And he ran for mayor on a plan to tear down the freeway and restore it as a stream, Cheonggyecheon Stream. And they made that happen in 3 years. It took 3 years to build the freeway, and then to tear it down as it runs through Seoul, another 3 years. And they converted the freeway to a beautiful stream running through the city. They tore down some old towers, apartment and office towers, and they tore it down and converted it to art forms like the shell that you see on the right of your screen, where tourists can come and take pictures. And this is what we call this emerging soft future of Korea. That Korea, you could argue that the nation on the rise needs not only bread, not only to become wealthy, but needs roses too. And roses are seen in this new form of Korean power, which is beautiful and soft and attracts tourism, and people want to take part in that new form of life that is emerging. And I think you can say from this that certain cities define their era and kind of define where we are at as a world. Chicago, if you look back at Chicago at the turn of the century, the late 1890s, it was the heart of the Industrial Revolution. It was the fastest growing city in the world. Books are written about it, of how Chicago represented the rise of America and the rise of the Industrial Revolution. Paris in the 1920s. This is the height of the kind of jazz era of Europe, optimistic Europe before World War II, and this kind of rise of Europe, this kind of culmination of European culture and optimism. And Paris was one of the great world cities in the 1920s. San Francisco in the 60s and 70s, this kind of worldwide protest culture. San Francisco kind of exemplified a lot of that protest culture, hippie culture, summer of love. All of those things happened in San Francisco in the 60s and 70s. New York City in the 1990s was a city that kind of represented the return of the city as a great force following the 70s crisis, the rise of rapid wealth on Wall Street, and the booming of this kind of Wall Street economy, the rise of Donald Trump himself out of the 1990s in New York City, and the World Trade Center being built. All of these in the 1990s New York City represented the 1990s. Today, I think we can say Seoul represents an emerging force in the world. And Seoul, half of Korea lives in Seoul. It is one of the most powerful economic forces in the world. Of course, Korea is a small nation and is not as powerful as China. But as a single city, there is no city in China perhaps as powerful as the city of Seoul. And as the world tilts to Asia, Korea is at the heart of that tilt, and Seoul is at the heart of Korea. And we see this newly emerging form of power, which we call soft power. Joseph Nye says in his books that a country may obtain the outcome it wants in world politics, not just through military force, but because other countries, admiring its values, emulating its example, aspiring to its openness, they want to follow that country. They think something interesting and exciting is going on in that country. And in this sense, it is important to set the agenda and attract others, not only force other countries with military force or economic sanctions, but use soft power. Get others to want the outcomes you want, to co-opt people rather than coerce them. I believe in Korea, we are seeing an example of what this soft power really is, where you get other nations to want what you have to offer, to desire your culture, to want to buy your cultural products. You don't do that through military force. You don't also do that through economic embargo. You do it through a new, beautiful form of soft power that is emerging in Korea. Apparently, if you just look at economic results in terms of what the world is buying, we want what South Korea is offering. We want the K-pop, we want the movies, we want the music. Tourism is rising. The world is turning to Asia and to nations like South Korea. And in the fact that we want what South Korea is offering, and in the fact that that is a new form of soft power, it's important to know that that wasn't by accident, but by the design of the Korean state and the Korean business community and the Korean people together. It is no accident that we want what South Korea is today offering.